Alright class, in this lesson we're going to take a look at complex numbers. If you didn't think numbers were complicated enough, we're going to make them more so, because now we're looking at imaginary numbers. Imaginary numbers we call I. I stands for, of course, imaginary. What an imaginary number is a square root of a negative. We can't have a square root of a negative. For example, if I had square root of negative 9, you couldn't do it before. And we would say, well, that doesn't exist. And now we're saying, you're right, it doesn't exist, but we're still going to keep playing with that particular number. So we do that by dealing with I, calling negative 1, square root of negative 1, I. I is the square root negative 1. Well, what happens is we can take the square root of negative 1, which is something that we call imaginary, because it doesn't really exist. It doesn't have a solution. So it's imaginary because it doesn't have any solution. But if you take that imaginary thing, the square root of negative 1, and then you square it, goodness sakes, look at that, we have a real number. So we took something that was imaginary, squared it, and then we have a real number. That's why complex numbers are complex. We have something imaginary, and all of a sudden you square it, and magically it exists all of a sudden. So this is why we do actually have to play with and consider negative square roots. So now I to the third power means I could take this answer, which was I squared, so this is I squared, and then just square that or raise it to another power of I again. In other words, I could take negative 1 and times it by I being the square root of negative 1. If I do that, that would give me negative square root of negative 1, or negative I, because again, this is just an I. So now, to get I to the fourth power, we would just take negative I, which is I to the third power, and just multiply it by another I. So this is I to the third power, which is negative I, and times it by another I. Okay? So what that looks like is we just take our negative square root of negative 1, which is what I was, negative I to the third, and we times it by a square root of negative 1, in other words, another I. That gives us negative 1 times positive 1, negative 1, because I take, and this is really just an I squared, so we have negative I squared, which turns out to be a positive 1. Okay? So again, the way that this works is I take it's really just I squared times I squared is another way of looking at it. I squared we said is negative 1, and this one is another way to break up I to the fourth power. So we could just say it's negative 1 times negative 1. So that's another way of looking at it, to say that it's positive 1. Bottom line, what you need to memorize, if I just confused you on how I worked that out, which is very possible, watch it again and try to make sense of it, but you need to understand is square root of negative 1, but we never write that in a problem, you'll actually just write I. But if you ever see an I squared, you need to memorize that that is actually equal to negative 1. If you ever see I to the third power, you need to memorize that that is actually just negative I. Okay? And finally, if you ever see I to the fourth, you need to memorize that that is actually just a positive 1. So this is a little chart that you should write down somewhere and actually memorize. Okay? So now we actually need to apply that memorized knowledge and simplify square roots of negative numbers. Before we would say, well, this is impossible, I don't have to do it. Well, now I'm saying, yeah, we actually do. So we have anything that has a negative inside the root. What you want to do is rewrite this to just be the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 20. Because that's what it really is. And so now we know what this is. This is just I times the square root of 20. That's almost simplified. The only thing we have to do now is just do our hockey stick method on the 20. The hockey stick method says you take your 20, do your little hockey stick, and we divide out a 2, and you're left with 10, divide out another 2, and I get 5. So really this reduces to 2 root 5, and you just put the I in there. Now the I doesn't actually go in front like that. The I actually goes in the middle right here. So the answer is 2I root 5. So we pulled out a 2 and left inside was the 5. Okay? So 2I root 5 is the answer for that one. Let's try this next one. So in this next one, the first thing I should do is pull out an I. Not literally, of course, but figuratively. But pulling out an I. So sorry, terrible humor. But here we go. Negative 1 is what we're looking for, times the square root of 36. And that is an equivalent expression, because I just pulled out the negative, and inside is still the 36. So in other words, I pulled out an I. That would really hurt if you actually did that. But we have, hopefully you just caught the humor, negative I root 36. And now, all I have to do to finish is just take the square root of 36, which is 6. Now, I don't write negative I6, because first of all, it looks really weird. We write it the same way we would write variables. I wouldn't write negative x6, I would write negative 6x. So same thing here, we're going to end up writing negative 6x is your solution. Okay. Now don't be one of my students who sees these two negatives, gets really excited, and changes them and just says the answer is positive 6. Because it's not. We have to pull out a negative 1, in other words, pull out an I, like I did here, and then that gives you your, oops, sorry, I put x over there, didn't I? I. Okay, negative 6i. Okay, so that's your answer. So now we're going to practice multiplying square roots together with negative numbers. Now, there's two ways to go here. The first method is to actually pull out i's like I was doing before. And I could rewrite this to be square root of negative 1 times 4, square root of 4, sorry, and then multiply that times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 8. In other words, this is I root 4 times I root 8. So if you do it this way, you pull out your I for both of those two problems, we get I squared root, you multiply the 4 and the 8 together to get 32. Okay, I squared, we said earlier, was negative 1. And then here we need to hockey stick the 32. And that would be 2, 16, 2, 8, 2, 4, 2, 2. So then that means I can pull out two groups of 2, and you're left with 1, 2. In other words, I get to pull out a 2 times another 2, and left inside is the 2. So I need to multiply all this together. Again, the I squared turned into my negative 1, so negative 1 times 2 gives me negative 4 root 2. Okay, that's the correct and only way to do it. But the other way to do it, that'll get you the wrong answer, that students do is they'll take the square root of negative 4 and they'll times it by the square root of negative 8, and they'll think, well, I can just multiply the 4 times the negative 4 times the negative 8, because that's what I've been doing before, and so that would give me the square root of positive 32. I don't have any i's or negatives. What's wrong with Professor Tucker? Well, you can't do that, because this doesn't exist, and this doesn't exist yet. Therein lies the problem. I can't actually do this problem until I pull out an I. So be careful. Make sure you pull out the I first before you do any multiplication. So again, first thing you have to do is pull out your i's for each problem before you multiply. The other way, the second way, will be the wrong answer.